For hundreds of years, absolute monarchs ruled Europe with an iron fist, stomping out every opposition that rose against their rule. While parliamentary monarchies existed in Europe, they still had to fight tooth and nail to pass simple reforms. This was until the revolution in France in 1789. The fires of liberalism set ablaze the common folk, and this fire was not extinguished until it burned Europe like a firestorm in 1848. We call this period the springtime of nations. From conservative peasants to radical politicians, everyone rose up against the nobility. After all, an empty stomach knows no boundaries. Before we move into the action directly, let's look at some of the reasons why the revolutions in 1848 happened in the first place. The first, and arguably the main reason, will be the industrialization of the European countries. Massive amounts of illiterate peasantry started to move into the cities as a result of the population boom that strained the food supply in the rural areas. In Europe, the population was 187 million in 1800, and in just 40 years, it became 266 million, which undoubtedly had severe consequences for your average Joe. It is safe to say that Europe was overpopulated, and this resulted in migrations across Europe, which further instigated conflicts. Some people went to the New World nations while the rest moved to cities. The most severe example of this was Paris. A lot of these migrants moved into the city were males, which also could potentially be violent writers if things didn't go their way. Unhappy and starving males means civil strife. Social cohesion started to shatter in cities, and the traditional order of society started to break down. City locals were not happy with migrants, to say the least. These workers had wretched lives. They didn't have the best diet, and they certainly didn't possess the best morals. You couldn't even be sure if this worker had a better life than the farmer in the countryside. But it seemed like you had a chance to live at least a few more years as a factory worker, compared to an agricultural worker, at least in France. You still had a very boring meal waiting for you at the end of the day, which prompted some people to steal from where they worked to eat just a bit more. Artisans were pushed back to the bottom of society. They had to compete with factories with massive manpower supported by bankers and merchants. This resulted in many of them joining secret societies, and the allure of socialism attracted them. Some of them were reorganized into new societies, but guilds in a traditional sense ceased to have any political and economic power. A gradual shift from feudalism to capitalism took place in Europe. Capitalism swiftly replaced the feudalism in German states, resulting in the condition of the factory workers worsening for some time. From Bavaria to Berlin, the consumption of meat for factory workers reduced from 1839 to mid-1840s. Coupled with this, the rapid industrialization of German states also undermined the power of the monarchy, which caused riots and conflicts between police and class workers. Let's move to the middle class. One of the biggest successes of the Industrial Revolution was the rise of the middle class in Western Europe. But to understand the revolutions of 1848, we have to break down the term of middle class and approach them as we move on. The richest of the middle class were manufacturers, bankers, and merchants. These were called grande bourgeoisie among the French. This 1% of the middle class controlled an important wealth of the middle class as a whole, and had considerable control over the French monarch. The same thing could be observed in Berlin, Prussia, where around 700 notable merchants concentrated their entire wealth among them in a city of hundreds of thousands of people. This French bourgeoisie had no goals such as liberal constitution or socialism. They were very conservative and wanted to be like the aristocrats of all times. If you are aware of the old money, new money terms, you will understand this part better. These wannabe aristocrats who had the old money were not aware or cared about the plight of the people, and they generally preferred buying land rather than investing in industrial enterprises. This would result in already expensive railway and industrial projects being handled by government funding, which means more taxes, which also means people are unhappy, which finally means unrest and rebellions. They used their power to force Louis Philippe to abdicate when civil unrest worsened. Knowing that he might be guillotined, Louis fled to England with his wife, and the Second Republic was established by a mob. Next to these pseudo-aristocrats were professional doctors, lawyers, teachers, and in general state bureaucrats. This middle class consisted of roughly 10% of the population in Western Europe. The growth of professionals was in direct proportion to bureaucrats. Bureaucracy expanded and grew to satisfy the needs of the population. Increasing the literacy rate meant more professionals to increase the quality of life of people. This caused a problem that was not easy to solve. Say you are a Frenchman who finished the lycée and you think you are ready to be whatever is in your mind, right? No, you get rejected for your dream job. So, you're a jobless, spiteful Frenchman now, another ticking bomb ready to blow up when the time is right. Fortunately, you are not alone. Many people who wanted to take jobs at public offices went unsatisfied and resorted to doing free professions, which means they worked for themselves. How successful that will be, I am doubtful. This problem posed a greater threat to Prussia and other Italian states. Bureaucracy was filled with aristocrats, and if you, someone who wants to be able to get a job at a state level, you must get a degree from law school, and the quota for entrance exams will only get more rigorous after the 1840s. It didn't help that you often had to work for no money under an apprenticeship. And we are not done yet, and as a thank you for everything you have done, the government will give you a massive middle finger by only accepting 20 people annually for judicial occupations. Good luck getting a job because you will need it. Thus, you have a class of unemployed and literate people who want to reform or get rid of the system. The lower middle class, who consisted of your usual store owners and small employers, couldn't get the right to vote and were highly critical of the regime at the time. Not only lower class were having serious problems with their livelihood, middle class was also unhappy with aristocrats holding power and government occupations and being unable to have a proper job. Let's roll a bit to our first point about peasantry. Well, of course, it will be irrational to assume that a peasant from Galicia is the same as a peasant from Aquitaine. This lower class was weak to famines, natural disasters, and to yearly fluctuating food prices. They were unstable and at times proved to be violent. Most of the peasants' income was spent on food, so even if food prices increased or decreased a little bit, this was a major issue to be solved. Railways in Europe were still in their infancy, so you were bound to where you lived and had to accept that you might not be able to eat bread for a good while. Hence, when the crop failures started to appear right and left in 1847 and 48, with an overpopulated Europe, public order started to shatter. A peek at the food prices shows us the food prices went as high as 150% in some places of Europe, and considering how the working class spend most of their livelihood on already garbage food, this demoralized and angered them. These miserable people who were barely able to feed themselves had nothing to lose, and when the Polish peasants rose up in Galicia in 1846 and destroyed much of the Polish nobility, this will become a bad omen for things to come. There was another cause of concern for royalists, who advocated for the stability of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. There was a general discontentment of people around Europe, most notably in France, where they just didn't like the monarchy. Therefore, when delegates from Europe came together to the Congress of Vienna, they decided that they were not going to concede anything to liberals. And in their logic, if you let liberals do what they want once, they will want more and cause a ruckus. So, Clemens von Metternich was one of the main speakers at the conference, and the statesman from the Austrian Empire argued for the constant repression of these ideas. However, it seems like repression was not efficient, as Russia mostly went away unscathed, while Europe had serious issues dealing with revolutionaries. While socialism was in its infancy and loosely defined by politicians at the time, the main principle was simple: the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. This idea unsurprisingly was adopted by factory workers, while the middle class was liberal, in a sense of no censorship laws, liberal constitutions, and concessions to the parliament. Well then, did the workers and middle class get together in the name of establishing republics and granting universal suffrage to people? Not exactly. If you listen to it carefully, you will notice that concessions were to be granted to parliament, not to the people. Many radical Republicans at the time were not keen on the idea of universal suffrage. Politicians in France did not want another revolutionary terror to occur again. The urban middle class was still allured by the idea of liberalism though. If we go to the east of the Rhine, however, we will see that a nationalist fervor took over the German people. Liberal and socialist ideas were secondary to this wish of unification. The biggest proof of this was the Frankfurt Congress that convened in 1848, wishing to create a German nation-state that would replace the German Confederation. The Prussian king, Frederick William IV, refused the offer. While you could be a conservative and a patriot, nationalists mostly tended to be liberal. This was especially the case for the Italians. Venice and Lombardy were under Austrian thumb, and to the south, the Bourbon monarch resided over southern Italy and Sicily. These monarchies were absolutist and didn't care about a nation state. To establish an Italian nation, those had to be destroyed. An attempt was made in 1830, but it failed because of Austrian intervention. Austrians suffered the worst from this problem. While they were a force to be reckoned with in the center of Europe, Austria had Hungarians, Poles, Bohemians, Slovaks, Croats, and many more people under themselves. These people rebelled for various reasons during the 19th century. Austrian Empire was trying to keep them by force, and this will come to bite them later. It is important to understand, and I hope I made it clear by now, that food shortages were not the only reason for this series of revolutions. After crop failures, awful living conditions, and constant repression, people felt like they had no choice but to carry the fight to the streets. But a tougher question to answer will be, whose revolution was this? The socialist workers or the so-called petite bourgeoisie, the liberal middle class? My educated answer will be that they worked together to reach their common goals, and when the differences between them grew wider and wider, they got into conflict with each other to claim the throne. Marx would famously write, "The insurrection is growing into the greatest revolution that has ever taken place, into a revolution of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie." We will see how this insurrection will unfold as we go through 1848. I have decided to take the countries one by one and examine how revolutions affected these countries, instead of going through a timeline. This way, we will be able to observe them easier. When France has a cold, all Europe sneezes, Metternich once famously said. Is he wrong though? When the February Revolution happened in France and Second French Republic was established, people in other states of Europe felt like acting up against the armed forces of the government in the name of liberalism and socialism. In the initial days of the revolution, the cities where insurgents fought with the army were Munich, Vienna, Buda and Pest, Venice and Krakow, Milan and Berlin. Workers rejoiced with the news of a republic being established and themselves tried establishing one. Common folk barricaded on the roads and blood flowed in the streets. This provisional government in France did not seek to recreate the revolutionary wars at the end of the 18th century. So when the other powers of Europe got wary of this revolutionary fervor, the government assured that such a thing was not going to happen. February Revolution didn't happen on one coordinated plan. The army brutally dispersed the crowds and committing a few fatal mistakes sealed the deal of the monarchy. Louis Philippe abdicated from the French throne and the parliament was trying to form a new government. The elected officials will be more than happy to grant reforms, but their appeal to the crowds fell on deaf ears. While the parliament tried to preserve the monarchy, they ultimately failed. Crowds swarmed the Chamber of Deputies demanding republic, and seeing no other way, parliament folded. A new provisional government was established with both conservatives and radical delegates. Thus, the February Revolution succeeded. As conservatives recovered from this radical shock and started to consolidate their power, the more radical and social side gradually lost seats and the support of the peasantry. Some radicals attempted insurrections, but this resulted in them being decimated by the government and inside the government. Finally, when the liberal conservative government abolished many of the reforms rolled by the provisional government, particularly national workshops, which were helping unemployed people, workers rose once again in the famous June Days uprising, barricading every corner of Paris. 10,000 people were killed and around 5,000 were sent to Algeria in exile. The result was a triumph of the liberal middle class over the radical workers. Our next victim is the Austrian Empire. Austria was not foreign to peasant revolts, but as the revolutionary fervor stirred up the empire, it got 10 times worse. In addition to revolutionary ideologies, nationalism was at its peak as Czechs rose up in Prague, Hungarians rose up in Buda and Pest, Poles rose in Galicia, and Italians as a whole united against the Austrian Empire, starting the Italian Wars of Independence. In this environment, students in Vienna demanded the resignation of Metternich, the guy who wished to preserve the monarchy. Austrian monarch complied, fearing his people turning against them in Vienna. Clemens von Metternich went to exile in England, which was seen as a great success by the revolutionaries. After gaining the upper hand in the revolution and splits appearing in the revolutionary ranks, the imperial court left Vienna and bombed it for days. You could make the argument that the June Days uprising in France and this event were similar. For Prague, they shelled the city until the populace surrendered. Slovaks supported the Austrian Empire in exchange for granting them more autonomy after the revolution. But you know how the saying goes, you either yeet or get yeeted. Slovaks didn't get the autonomy they wished, and the suppression of their culture continued. Some Slovaks fought against the Austrians, so the situation was more complicated. Hungarians granted Croatians no autonomy under them, so they joined Austria instead. Polish uprisings didn't go anywhere at Galicia and remained to be on small scale compared to other rebellions. Not content with their failures, some Poles left for Italy and grouped with a Polish poet, Adam Mickiewicz, and formed the Mickiewicz Legion in hopes of liberating his homeland one day. While the unit did not reach enough manpower and prestige to do so, they fought against monarchists with their revolutionary brethren in Milan and Genoa. A couple of Polish generals also participated in the revolutions. Wojciech Tchaikovsky led Piedmont troops but were defeated. Another general, Henryk Dębinski, joined Hungarians with a Polish regiment of his own, but they too could not escape the fate of their comrades. Croatian and Austrian armies were preparing to defeat the Hungarian armies in Pest, but they would lose a lot of strength if they did it just by themselves. So the Habsburg monarch had to ask the Russian Tsar for help. While at first he was reluctant, he helped them anyway. Austrian armies sucked, and they had to consolidate their power at the initial stage of the revolution. Italian armies were defeated, and Piedmont forces agreed to withdraw from Austrian-held territories. For now, the revolution was mostly over, and the Austrian Empire finally sighed in a moment of relief. Hungarians were still holding, and they were the only rebels left. Austrians and Russians devastated the rebels, ending the rebellion for the most part. Decades later, Austrians gave up on their dreams of leading Germany and got together with Hungarians instead, creating the Ausgleich, or for normies, Austria Hungary in 1864. A little late, I know. At least with this dual monarchy structure, another Hungarian revolution will be prevented. While the revolution failed to achieve its political goals, economic progress was not one of them. Korui, labor that lords could demand of their serfs, which was very feudalistic in nature, was abolished, paving the way for further economic prosperity. Next country, please. Oh, welcome, Italy, or what used to be of you. In Italy, people wanted to unite the Italian peninsula, and they wanted to be a republic. Well, this is a romantic appeal of history. The reasons for the unrest were more or less similar in the Italian peninsula like other European nations. Feudalism still had a tight grip on society, and the transition to capitalism will be way slower. Italian agriculture was widely inefficient and had worse price fluctuations than some of the other European countries. Some of the riots in Italian peninsula predate the French rebellions, which will help you with the idea that French people are not some divine leaders of liberalism fighting on the frontiers for humanity. Anyway, enough of stating facts. Conditions of awful life for workers and peasants forced them to care about filling their stomachs rather than worrying about a nation state, thus widening the differences between the nationalist middle classmen from the social reformist low class. This doesn't mean they were all like that, but the majority shared this sentiment. A liberal pope, however, was something people didn't expect, and monarchs had to reform or face backlash from crowds. Ironically, Charles Albert of Piedmont was ultimately to lead an Italian force against the Austrians, was the last monarch in the peninsula to grant a constitution. However, his bold stance on Austrian aggression on the peninsula made them to be admired by the patriots. He declared war on Austria after Milanese people joined him. The First War of Italian independence was a disaster, as they were not prepared at all. He went to Portugal after his abdication and died there. The Pope also fled Rome to take refuge in France, as the Roman Republic was established by the revolutionary forces. Crowds demanded more reform, and seeing no other way, Pius IX had to leave. French forces would later move and reinstall the Pope after the permission of Louis Napoleon. Third one, don't worry. And the revolutionaries were defeated. Italians had to wait for another time for their independence. In the south, Sicilian king granted liberal reforms to the people and at the same time sent armies to quell an insurrection in Sicily. After things calmed down, he rewrote his reforms, making himself an absolute ruler once again. In the end, the revolutions in Italy failed because the urban middle class failed to promote the concept of nationalism to socialist workers and conservative peasants. And there were armies defeated, there's that too. We shall move to our last major section, German states. While major insurrections did not happen in Prussia except in Poznan, an assembly known today as the Frankfurt National Assembly took place in Frankfurt. This conference consisted of mainly middle-class liberals, and compared to more radical delegates who wanted to establish a republic, wanted a liberal constitution. While at first this conference garnered attention from the Germans, it lost its significance in the long run. Not only they didn't have the military and political power to do anything, but their confidence in the Prussian king, whose positive reforms at first also died out. Not only Frederick William IV was a conservative Prussian who outplayed the reformists later, but their also failure at the First Schleswig War damaged their image as the leader of the Germans. Prussia was very much diplomatically isolated these days, and the Austrian Empire took advantage of the situation by increasing its influence in the German states. Oh yeah, and an idiot instigated a revolt in Baden, the group of militia, and fled to Switzerland when it failed. To regard the 1848 revolutions as a tragic but heroic act of history where common folk stood against the monarchs and failed is to misunderstand history and live in your imagination. If we were to discuss on what were the main reasons for the failure of the revolutions, the first one will be the loss of interest or simply apathy by the peasantry. They were not interested in whether you wanted a republic or reforms for the factory workers. In most cases, after the harsher living conditions were lifted for peasants, they withdrew to themselves, stripping much of the support revolutionaries could have had. Ideas such as socialism, nationalism, and liberalism to an extent were in their infancy and there were no clear cuts other than simple definitions that the people agreed on. This resulted in more fractions between the groups. There was also the case of liberal bourgeoisie wishing to continue the governments they took over. They were not keen on the ideas of a republic or granting concessions to plebs like you. I would like to point out how the concept of nationalism was hollowed and changed by the conservative monarchs to use it in their favor. Otto von Bismarck and Emmanuel II will be the greatest example of this. Before nationalism changed its style to suit linguistic needs, it was combined with liberalism, wanting to tie the state and people in a way where both worked for each other. The consent of the people was the priority, and the basis of their ideas was taken from history and literature. While this idea did not exactly appeal to lower classes, it is better than nothing, I guess. Other countries which did not have massive social upheavals like Britain and Russia also contributed to the failures of some revolutions. Prussia backed down after interruption by Britain and Russia in Schleswig-Holstein, disappointed the nationalists while Russians suppressed the Magyar revolts. Britain and Russia suppressed the revolutionaries but for different reasons. Russia was a country run by serfs and with an absolute ruler who led a sect of Christianity. Britain was more progressive compared to its European counterparts but pursued the status quo in Europe. Besides, if they supported the revolutionaries, Irish people would point out there is hypocrisy, harboring further resentment between Britain and Irish people. In France, Napoleon III was victorious in elections and made himself an emperor after a coup. Prussia's stronghold and power grew stronger, but Austria fumbled. Their victory was illusory. Cutting down the revolutions made them weaker, and the average person's opinion of the Habsburg monarch simply faltered day by day. After losing the Brothers' War and the Second Italian War of Independence, Austria had to grant autonomy to Hungarian and other nationalities in their borders, making them a wholesome 100-Chungus country. One of the only countries in which liberalism had immediate success was Sardinia-Piedmont. Victor Emmanuel II, unlike his predecessor, took steps to implement liberal reforms and increase the commercial trade in his country, modernizing the country for future conflicts with Austrians. Modernization of the economies in Western Europe was the most important success of the revolutions. Stock trading increased, and steps were taken to optimize industrial and agricultural production. Leaders knew they couldn't take this many L's again. Most, if not all countries got rid of serfdom and moved to a capitalist and industrial economy. The middle class grew as a result and became more politically active. Only in Russia these did not happen, but they will reap what they sowed with a revolution in 1917. We have to close the books of history for this time. With its good and bad sides, history is a strange set of events. I hope you liked the video. Don't forget to like and share it, and have a good day.